To date, the African Development Bank has been intimately involved in Africa's energy transition. And perhaps the best way to explain it is to look at a bit of statistics. Between 2010 and 2019, Africa's increase in renewables grew by 77%. Over the same period, the African Development Bank's investments in renewable energies increased, the proportion increased to 70% between the same period, and since 2016 to 85%. So obviously, you can see a very strong correlation between the growth of renewables on the African continent and with the bank's investments. But the percentages I've talked about translate to about more than 2,000 megawatts of additional generation capacity. So that on its own says that there is a close linkage between Africa's energy transition and the bank's increasing renewable energies investments. And some of these examples include the 510 megawatt Nur Ouazzizate solar power project in Morocco, which is arguably the largest concentrated solar power project in the world, as well as the 310 megawatt wind power project in Kenya, Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya, the largest wind power project on the African continent. But more recently, late last year, we amended our energy policy to preclude further investments or new investments in coal. That is significant as far as Africa's energy transition is concerned. So in terms of what we would want to do in future, first of all, we are reviewing the bank's energy policy comprehensively with a view to increasing participation or involvement in energy transition. That's number one. Number two, we are also looking at, as part of what I called addendum to the energy policy of last year, whereby we precluded further investments in new coal investments, we also provided or undertook to support Africa's just energy transition plans, because these are critical in laying the foundation of the transition process. But obviously, we will also look to participating in a just energy transition plan implementation, including the investments thereof. On the contrary note, the Paris Agreement is quite clear that for the low emitters, they will be allowed to peak in the second half of the century with a view to achieving carbon neutrality, or what other people refer to as net zero, at the end of the century. So whereas for most of the developed world in particular, the target is to achieve net zero by 2050. For Africa, as is the case for most other emitters, they are actually allowed to peak in the second half of the century and achieve net zero or carbon neutrality by 2100, which means that Africa is actually allowed to continue to emit more, or to continue emitting until they can reach neutrality. But I don't think Africa will be that irresponsible. But what we are saying is that there is no contradiction whatsoever between what the bank advocates in terms of supporting gas. And in any case, our support for gas is strategic and very deliberate, in the sense that we are saying that we will support projects that are specifically aligned with the Paris Agreement. And this alignment with the Paris Agreement are a function of what we call nationally determined contributions. So the idea here is to ensure that projects that we support are part of a country's nationally determined contribution, which essentially is a plan that explains how that particular country will endeavor to reduce emissions towards carbon neutrality over a finite period of time. So really, I actually do not believe that we will be able to, we are inconsistent with the Paris Agreement by the bank supporting this kind of initiatives. But that's number one. Number two, we try to say we want to promote transition. Unfortunately, the sources of energy, the renewable source of energy that we have, especially with regard to wind and solar, these are very intermittent. And for you to be able to enhance or increase the penetration of renewables, it is imperative that you have what we call flexible generation, which will ensure that in the event, because of a climatic condition, there is a change in the output from the solar or wind power project, then you are able to compensate for the loss of production using flexible source of generation. And gas is actually a very useful source of flexible generation. So in this particular case, gas will actually be performing the role of an enabler to increase integration of renewables in our power systems. The last item I wanted to say is that we know, and you've heard those statistics during this particular conference, that today 900 million Africans, actually approaching a billion Africans, do not have access to clean cooking. LPG is an incredible source of clean cooking and has underpinned the progress of increased access to clean cooking to countries such as Indonesia, which achieved 80% access to clean cooking by 2018, or even China, which achieved 80% access to clean cooking, precisely at 70% access to clean cooking by 2020. So these are examples of countries that have actually used gas to increase access to clean cooking. And the beauty with this is that access to clean cooking has also a significant impact, especially in Africa, on deaths. Because to date, 600,000 people die because of indoor pollution because of lack of clean cooking. So that is one example. The other one is that the gas has an important role in industrializations, including, for example, in petrochemicals, fertilizer, and of course, the new kid on the block, hydrogen. And we, in this particular case, we would look at, when I spoke to the potential role of the bank as far as gas is concerned, this is an area whereby we would advocate that any gas plants that we are involved in are also ready for green hydrogen as and when the technology is ready. This is in order to avoid the risk of stranded assets, because you don't want to have an asset which will become stranded once green hydrogen becomes the primary source of fuel for power production, as far as gas is concerned. Again, thank you very much, Monica. Here, when we are talking about Africa's energy transition, what we are looking at is the participation of the private sector in decarbonization, for example, in generation. Unless what is less spoken about is the role of transmission, because I'll give you the example of South Africa. Most of the power in South Africa, most of the coal assets in South Africa are based in Mpumalanga and in the Limpopo area. So northeast of the country. And they supply power to Gauteng, around Johannesburg, the area around Johannesburg, which are the major load centers. However, renewables in South Africa are actually in the west coast. Sorry, what they call the West Cape, North and Northwest Cape. So which means that all the transmission lines that were coming down like that will have to be coming like that. So the issue of transmission lines is important, but largely in the past, transmission lines were developed by the state. But the amount of transmission that will be required, lines that are required, will mean that there is a need for additional resources to be provided through the private sector. So in this particular case, I see an opportunity for the private sector to play a role not only in generation, but also in transmission. Of course, when we are talking about transition as well, we will be talking about diversification as well as digitalization of the sectors. But what is actually important also is to note that in order to achieve the rate and scope of changes of transforming our energy sectors to be able to achieve the transition at the speed that is required, we will need to have private sector investments because, as I sort of just alluded, public sector funding is no longer available. It's very, very limited. Okay? And therefore, and this is specifically because today as we speak, Africa, like any other part of the world, most part of the world, especially the developing countries, is grappling with the fiscal, the widening of the fiscal deficit because of the post-COVID recovery measures that people are adopting. Of course, you have climate change issues. Climate change never went on sabbatical just because COVID happened. And also, you have the issues of food security that is currently very, very topical. And the food insecurity, we all know, is because of the Russia-Ukraine war situation. And therefore, it is expected that the only viable alternative to this public funding should be the private sector. Indeed, the private sector is expected to contribute up to 70% of the investments in renewables. And in this particular case, the opportunities for the private sector will be, number one, in energy, what I've talked about, generation and transmission, transportation. We are talking about e-mobility, the utilization of renewables for purposes of transportation. And then, of course, we are looking at the development of green hydrogen. So in my view, what is absolutely essential is for the governments to create the enabling environment, in other words, legal and regulatory framework that enable private sector participation sector participation in investments that will support energy transition on the African continent. I thank you.